Ever feel like the world's playing by a different set of rules?
Yeah.
One where the same effort gets some people way ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're going to unpack this whole superlinear returns thing. And trust me, once you see it, you start spotting these opportunities kind of everywhere.
It really does reframe how you view success. That whole like input equals output idea.
Right.
It so often just doesn't cut it.
It's like that saying um, about the lottery being a tax on people who are bad at math.
Yeah.
This is like the opposite. This is about understanding how to really win at, well, everything.
Precisely. And the notes you've got here, this piece on superlinear returns, it gets right to the heart of it. It's not always about working, twice as hard to get twice the result. It's more about finding the spots where a little extra effort, boom,
Yeah.
yields exponentially bigger outcomes.
So less about like that straight, predictable line of progress, more about those like hockey stick growth curves we see in like
Right.
startups.
Exactly. And the author actually gives this really clear example using competing businesses. So let's say your product, even if it's just slightly worse than a competitor's, you're not necessarily looking at slightly lower sales, right? You might be looking at NO sales, no customers, no business, game over. The difference in outcome isn't linear with that tiny difference in effort.
Oh, that's way more intense than like missing a question on a test. This isn't getting an A versus a B. It's whether you're even on the scoreboard.
That's a great way to put it. And this isn't just, some business school concept. Think about fame or how ideas spread, even like personal growth. Understanding superlinearity is kind of like a cheat code, but for pretty much any field.
Okay, I'm definitely hooked.
Yeah.
But superlinear returns still sounds kind of abstract. Like, where do we even start wrapping our heads around it?
It's actually pretty straightforward once we break it down. The source points to two main engines, so to speak, that drive these outsized returns. One is exponential growth, the other is thresholds.
Okay, so let's start with that first one, exponential growth. I'm guessing this is more nuanced than just things getting bigger over time, though, right?
You got it. It's not just about things growing, it's the rate of growth that's accelerating. Imagine if your skills doubled every year, the difference between, say, year 5 and year 10 isn't just 5 years worth of progress. It's this huge, like almost unimaginable leap in ability. That's the power of exponential growth.
Okay, yeah, now that you put it that way, that's kind of mind-blowing. And the source uses a pretty unexpected example to illustrate this. Growing bacteria.
Right. It might seem kind of random, but bacteria, when they're cultivated right, are like the ultimate example of exponential growth. Here's the thing. Someone who's, say, an expert at growing a certain bacteria isn't going to just see slightly better results than someone who's brand new to it. They could see results that are astronomically bigger, even if the newbie's, putting in a decent effort.
So it's not even just about like blindly putting in the hours. It's about understanding the specific things that unlock that explosive growth, right?
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially for folks like you who are into the startup world.
Always up for a good startup analogy, so hit me with it.
A lot of startups, they focus just on getting more users, which, makes sense on the surface. Bigger numbers, bigger success, right? But what matters even more is how fast that user base is multiplying. It's the growth rate that tells you if you're on that exponential curve or just kind of, chugging along.
So a startup that's growing its user base by, say, 10% every month is ultimately going to be more successful than one that's adding a slat 500 new users every month, even if that 500 seems like a bigger win at the beginning.
Now you're thinking superlinearly. There's a reason why accelerators like Y Combinator, they're obsessed with growth rate. It's not just about vanity metrics or bragging rights. It's about figuring out if you've actually tapped into that exponential curve, because that's a major indicator of superlinear returns down the line.
Okay, so exponential growth, that's one engine driving these superlinear returns. But what about that second one, thresholds? It kind of makes me think of like leveling up in a video game.
Oh, I like that analogy. Yeah, sometimes it's not about like gradual improvement. It's about suddenly making this leap onto a whole new playing field. And the source uses a really good analogy to illustrate this, the world of sports.
Okay, you got my attention. How does that work?
So think about any competition, right? Whether you win by like a tiny bit or a total landslide, you get the same reward, the win. It's not about being just a little bit better. It's about crossing that threshold of victory. That's where the superlinearity comes in.
Right, because all that effort, all that training, it only really pays off once you hit that win condition.
Yeah.
Like, boom, suddenly you're in a different league.
Exactly. The author talks about how these thresholds, they often create this winner-takes-all kind of dynamic, which, it can seem a little brutal.
Kind of makes you wonder about fairness. right?
Mm.
Like, is this whole threshold thing inherently unfair?
It's a really good question, and the source does address that a little bit. The author's point is that competition in itself isn't like inherently good or bad. What matters is what that prize actually is, and if it's something that's actually worth fighting for.
So it's about being more mindful of, like, the actual game we're playing, not just chasing victory for the sake of it.
Yeah, exactly. It's about understanding the rules, understanding what's at stake, and then, choosing your battles. Because sometimes aiming for a different kind of win, even if it doesn't have that clear threshold moment, it might be more rewarding in the long run.
That's a really good point. It's easy to get so caught up in that competitive spirit that you kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. I'm curious, though, how do these two forces, the exponential growth and the thresholds, how do they actually work together?
That's where things get really interesting because often they appear in tandem. Like you cross a threshold and then things start to take off exponentially.
So it's like you unlock a hidden level or something, and suddenly your progress just, like, skyrockets.
Precisely. The source actually uses fame as an example. Might seem kind of a random example, but it illustrates this perfectly.
Okay, I gotta ask, how does fame tie into all this?
Well, think about how people typically become famous, right? There's a certain level of like talent or visibility they need to hit, right? It's like getting on that metaphorical A-list in people's minds. That's a threshold.
Right. It's not like every person who posts a cool video online suddenly becomes like a household name.
Exactly. But once you do cross that threshold, once you're on that A-list, your reach, it amplifies exponentially. You've got more fans, which leads to more exposure, which leads to even more fans. It's that snowball effect, but you often need to clear that initial hurdle to really get it rolling.
Wow, I've never thought about it that way before, but that makes total sense. Now I'm wondering, are there examples of this in less, I don't know, glamorous areas, like just my regular everyday life?
Oh, absolutely. Think about learning any new skill. It
Mhm.
could be anything from playing an instrument to like learning to code. There's always that point where you go from like fumbling around with the basics to really getting it? That's a threshold.
Oh, totally. It's like when you're first learning to code and it all looks like complete gibberish,
Mm.
and then click, something shifts in your brain, and suddenly you're not just copying code,
Hmm.
you're actually understanding how to write it yourself.
Exactly. And once you clear that initial hurdle, once you really grasp those fundamentals, your ability to learn new things in that field, it just accelerates like crazy. You've unlocked this new level of understanding that you can build on exponentially. And the author argues that this applies to almost every field, really.
So mastering the fundamentals, no matter how tedious it might feel at the time, it's like we're investing in our own future exponential growth. We're setting ourselves up for those superlinear returns down the line.
Exactly. It's about playing that long game. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most important wins aren't about instant gratification. They're about setting yourself up for success that just keeps compounding over time.
This is seriously making me rethink my whole approach to learning. I have a tendency to like jump around from one new thing to the next,
Mhm.
but maybe I need to like really focus on nailing those fundamentals to really unlock that superlinear learning curve.
That's a fantastic takeaway. It's super easy to fall into the trap of chasing novelty, but often the real magic, it happens when you commit to like truly mastering the foundation of something you're passionate about.
So we've covered a ton of ground here, but it's definitely starting to click into place. Exponential growth, thresholds, those are like the secret ingredients to those superlinear returns. But the big question is, how do we actually UEC this knowledge? How do we go from understanding these concepts to actually spotting those opportunities for superlinear returns in our own lives? It feels like we've like uncovered this hidden code to success, but I'll be honest, actually putting this into practice, it feels kind of daunting. It's easy to say, find exponential growth or look for thresholds, but out in the real world, it's not always so obvious, right?
You're right. There's not always like a big flashing sign. Luckily, the source actually gives some really practical advice here. They boil it down to two main things. One, seek work that compounds. Two, be ruthlessly curious.
Okay, work that compounds. Getting some flashbacks to high school math class, what does that even mean in like my day-to-day life?
It's simpler than it sounds. Think of it this way. If you do well at one stage, does that naturally make the next stage easier or more impactful? That's a sign of compounding.
So like if I get really good at, say, writing code, then the next programming language I try to learn is going to be way easier to pick up, which then makes me even better at coding overall. kind of like that snowball effect of exponential growth we were talking about before.
You got it. And it's not even just about individual skills. The author talks about like building infrastructure, right? Each
Yeah.
step you take is laying the foundation for something even bigger, which creates this upward spiral. And it works the same way with growing an audience or developing your skill set, even building relationships.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see how that all connects back to those superlinear returns. But what about that second piece of advice? Be ruthlessly curious. Sounds kind of intense, to be honest.
It's about being really deliberate with your curiosity. The author's point is like, don't just chase whatever's trendy or whatever seems easy, you know? Really dig into what you're genuinely interested in, even if it seems like kind of niche or a little offbeat at first.
So don't follow the hype. Follow what really, lights you up inside.
Exactly. Those unique interests you have, they're like a treasure map. They reveal all these opportunities that other people just completely miss because, well, they're not looking at the world through your lens.
It's like that saying, curiosity is the engine of achievement.
Right. And the best part is this isn't about burning yourself out or, working around the clock. The source actually talks about the importance of balance too.
Okay, good, because I was starting to get a little stressed thinking about adding ruthless curiosity to my to-do list.
It's not about doing more. It's about doing what matters. Rest, having good habits, taking care of yourself, those are all still crucial, especially for peak performance over the long term. It's about making sure you're getting the most out of the effort you DO put in.
That's good to hear. I'm all for ambition, but, sustainability is key.
Mhm.
Speaking of which, the source mentions something that feels really relevant here, this idea that traditional organizations are becoming less and less influential. It's kind of a weird time to be alive, don't you think?
It's exciting, but yeah, it's a little daunting too, right? It used to be that you needed a big company, some kind of institution, to really get ahead. They controlled the resources, the connections, pretty much everything. But now, technology and this whole shift towards individuals having more power, it's changing the game entirely.
So it's like the old gatekeepers are losing their grip a little bit, which is awesome because it means there are way more opportunities for people to kind of rise to the top based on their own merit.
Exactly. But, there's always a catch. It also means more risk. You're not sheltered by this big organization anymore. It's really on you to develop your skills, build your network, and chart your own course.
It's good we're all becoming entrepreneurs, but of our own lives.
I love that. And that ties in perfectly with what we've been talking about, superlinear returns. In this new world, the rewards for being truly exceptional, for reaching that top level of skill and impact, they're even higher than they used to be.
Because the competition might be tougher, but the potential payoffs are bigger too.
Precisely. It's definitely a high stakes game, but for those who are, willing to really embrace the challenge, the possibilities are pretty incredible. And it all comes back to that same idea. Investing in yourself, investing in your growth, your learning, and following your curiosity wherever it leads.
This whole conversation has been a serious mind shift for me. I'm definitely going to be looking at things through this superlinear lens from now on.
That's what we were hoping for. It's not about magic shortcuts. It's about changing how you see the world. It's about seeing the potential that's already inside you.
And speaking of seeing things differently, the source ends on this really thought-provoking note. They say that, curiosity might be an even more powerful driver of success than ambition, which is, wow, makes you think, right?
It really does. Ambition, it can be great, but it can also kind of push us down these really narrow paths, always focused on external validation and stuff. But curiosity is what really cracks open the world. It's what helps us make those unexpected connections, have those breakthroughs that lead to, you guessed it, superlinear returns.
So I guess the question for all of us is, what are we really curious about? And are we brave enough to follow that, even if it takes us off the beaten path a little bit?
That's the adventure we all get to choose. Who knows what amazing things we'll discover when we do.